Welcome to Beyond Perception. I'm Simon, and my guest today, Dr. Mark Ashton. Welcome, Mark. To
Thank you.
just share a brief introduction of
Yes.
yours. You are the founder of IQ Mindware and an applied cognitive neuroscientist with a Ph.D. from Carnegie Mellon and University of Pittsburgh. You also lectured at the University of Cambridge, and your specialization is developing brain training programs and aimed at enhancing intelligence and resilience, as far as I understand. Please add anything you deem important.
No, that's a good summary. Thanks, Simon. The and along with the IQ Mindware cognitive intervention work, I got a full-time role as a lecturer in University of Essex Online. It's one of these new online universities, but we're doing quite a lot of research through the University of Essex Online psychology laboratory and using online cloud kind of format for running experiments and so on. So I've got that day job as well, and that's a lecture in cognitive psychology and neuroscience.
Amazing. Yeah. So I'm very looking forward to this conversation. And just for a bit of context, I think I got to know through Dave Asprey about your work, and it must be something like
Right?
eight, 9 years ago. I started
Yeah, a while
training
ago.
with
Yeah,
your
yeah.
NBAC software to that
Right.
was the target then to raise my IQ. And I literally did a test before
Great.
I started and then passed the
Mm.
Mensa test. And I don't recall the exact decrease, but it was definitely significant. So I
Great.
just recently had this epiphany. Let's do a podcast, no? To um,
Mm.
and here we are.
Great. Well,
So
yeah.
um,
Well, that's good to hear. Yeah.
yeah, and
uh,
so
yeah.
maybe as a start, before we talk about the intelligence or what it is and its dimensions and how to enhance it, why and how did you become interested in this field? What intrigues you about intelligence?
Um, Well, I started off as a sort of very typical cognitive scientist back as an undergraduate. It's actually at Bristol University in the UK, and I was interested in visual perception. That's a sort of an entry point into cognitive science. And those were the early days of computational modeling, and I was quite interested in that. And from there, I went on to this quite spearheading program in the States, Center for the Neural Basis of Cognition. It was an early cognitive neuroscience program. And so, really, I had academic interests. I was interested in understanding, vision initially, and then that expanded into various types of executive functions, including working memory, attention control, problem solving. And these are the kind of staples of the the researchers in the program I was doing here at the Center of Neural Bases of Cognition, and many of those graduates who I was working with at the time have gone on to study intelligence. They've gone on to study working memory, various types of attention studies, and so on. So it's kind of a natural continuity of my educational kind of path and as a cognitive neuroscientist. So with the rise of the internet and cloud experimentation and a lot of the kind of freedom to develop my own business and so on, I sort of branched off from just a purely academic role and started developing these interventions in intelligence and resilience, mental health interventions, and so on. So I've just sort of branched off based on my training as setting up on my own. Um, and I'm pretty well doing what a lot of my fellow graduates have done in a way. I mean, a lot of them are developing interventions. They're not just trying to understand intelligence, they're also trying to translate that theoretical understanding and the research they're doing into practical applications to help in education and help in augmenting intelligence in various ways. So I come out of a cohort, you could put it
Hmm.
that way, and it pretty well kind of falls out pretty naturally from that cohort.
Hmm. And with your decades of experience, what is your understanding of intelligence itself? What is intelligence? Is it possible to define intelligence?
So the most sort of prevalent understanding of intelligence is the psychometrics based approach. And on this approach, intelligence is measurable by IQ test, standardized IQ test. You get a single IQ score from such a test, with a average value of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. And you've experienced that, in
Hmm.
terms of what score you need to get into Mensa, two standard deviations from the mean, 130, for example,
Hmm.
plus. Um, and this approach kind of assumes that there's a single underlying capacity that underlies lots of diverse cognitive abilities like spatial ability, verbal ability, numerical ability, and so on. And it can be sort of measured through various statistical techniques using standardized tests involving what's called factor analysis. And the idea is you can find what's called the latent variable that explains the sort of differences in scores between individuals on these different cognitive tests. And that latent variable is called a G factor. It sort of explains the correlations that are found between all these different subtests. And it's a very consistent result. It's called the positive manifold, the positive correlations in a population between different types of cognitive tests, like verbal tests, visuospatial tests, working memory tests, and so on. You find that there are positive correlations, between all of these different tests. And this kind of G factor, it's a latent theoretical construct that's kind of posited to explain those correlations between those tests. And so that's the basis of, a lot of under our current public understanding of what
Hmm.
general intelligence is. There's one underlying cognitive ability that accounts for the diverse kind of positive correlations between abilities. But there are challenges to that, and there are two very prominent research traditions that challenge that. One's called process overlap theory. And on this theory, there is no one underlying ability. There's been no success in really pinning down what such an ability might be neurobiologically, for example. You can't point to something like white matter integrity, or I don't know, neuron conduction speeds, or any particular set of genes, to
Hmm.
say that is this intelligence factor, this general intelligence factor. And they propose it's a kind of an artifact, the underlying statistical construct of G. Really, there is no such thing underlying that. It's a statistical kind of reality, but there's no
Hmm.
underlying kind of basis in reality to that. And really, what we're looking at on their theory is what they call process overlap. If you do two different kind of tasks, a spatial task and a quantitative task, and you find there's a correlation between the two of them, it's not the G factor that explains that. It's various shared processes related more to, for example, working memory or processing speed. Could be a few processes that tend to kind of overlap and be kind of tapped for all of these different types of tasks. And they may be sort of executive functions like working memory or inhibitory control or something like that. And so there's no underlying, sort of one unified ability there.
Hmm.
There are potential multiple executive functions that tend to be tapped in all of these diverse tests that we're taking. So that's another approach. And another one that
Hmm.
I really like, and it's kind of I'm using it more in my own framework that I've developed,
Hmm.
which is called mutualism theory. And it's associated with Van der Maas, some really insightful researcher who's essentially said, look, by looking at intelligence this way, we're kind of always looking at it in a snapshot in time, just in one time point. And really what we're neglecting is the way that intelligence as a construct evolves over time through development. And he basically argues that if you go back into early childhood, you'll find research suggests that many of these abilities, like quantitative ability and verbal ability, are actually uncorrelated. There is no correlation. But through the educational process and through development in childhood, by developing one of those skills, like verbal ability, that synergizes and interacts with, say, quantitative ability. It enables you to frame quantitative problems verbally, for example, that helps in solving those kinds of problems. And so there are these kind of mutual interactions between these different skills that over time end up resulting in more overall correlations between all of these abilities. And so the positive manifold, the basis of what we in the psychometric tradition see as being this G factor, he explains as being really the kind of product of a developmental process of lots of synergizing interactions that end up converging in more correlations. Yeah, so again, there's no underlying G factor. It's more to do with, the way in which an ecology might evolve in a self-organizing way and a self-reinforcing way over time to support, multiple functions that interact well together.
So when I'm hearing that, what I'm making out of it, please correct me if that's wrong. The higher the correlation between different capacities, the higher the intelligence of the system.
Well, that's another interesting aspect to this. Really, he's talking more about why that positive manifold exists in the first place. He's not really quantifying the amount of correlation. But what's interesting about that kind of the extent of correlation, I mean, it's some interesting sort of statistical facts about this. If you look at a low IQ average country, and you do this sort of factor analysis to find out how much of the variation between individuals on their scores on IQ tests is attributed to, can be explained by the G factor, it turns out it's much higher than is the case in a country that has a high average IQ. Okay, so in a country with a high average IQ, that G factor's explanatory power is actually less than in a country where the average IQ is lower. And that kind of suggests that in the higher IQ country, in where you do find an average IQ score is much higher, quite a lot of that higher IQ is attributed more to specialized educational training for test-specific abilities that you're not getting in the average lower IQ country. So you need to kind of separate out in the statistic that component that is actually shared and correlated, across these different tests from unique abilities specific to particular, types of cognitive ability. And those may be more refined through a more developed educational system. That's another kind of aspect of that.
One question, which might be a little bit off topic, but you said before IQ is normalized. And
this is, well, I mean, when we're looking at the psychometric traditions,
where I want to go with is, how does our current equivalent of 100 IQ points compares to 20, 50, 100, 200 years back?
Yeah. So, well, this is another interesting kind of dimension, to this whole issue. And all of these kind of different ways of looking at it suggest that there really isn't something that corresponds in reality to this abstract concept of G, right? Because that them, by the way, that G itself is something that depends on the population in terms of its explanatory power. And the question you ask is, it turns out that the average IQ score has, well, it's changed quite considerably over the generations. So if you go back to 1900 and you compare scores on the same kind of problems, so you have, you make sure the test questions are the same. You can see that there's what's called a Flynn effect. So there tends to be, on average, in a population, an increase of IQ scores in the population of about 2 or 3 points each decade, and that's just gone up and up and up over the decades, and that's called the Flynn effect. But what's interesting about that is that since typically in Western developed countries, since the 1990s, the Flynn effect has reversed. And so what we're seeing is increasing drop in IQ, in the average IQ of a population, by, from 2000 to 2020, it may be, say, 2-point drop on average or something like that, or more. And in the UK, apparently, it's particularly bad.
In Germany?
Yeah, I'm not sure about Germany, but Flynn, the researcher himself, suggested that the UK's culture has kind of gone through this process of dumbing down, the social media and so on. So he's trying to explain why it's so bad in the UK. So this changes over time, this standardized average.
And so you mentioned a few aspects which contribute or are part of intelligence. You mentioned a verbal capacity, a visual capacity, working memory. I think from the little bit I prepared myself and investigated, you also reference to fluid intelligence, crystallized intelligence. Could you take us through the different aspects or the current understanding of the dimensions of intelligence?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so, well, again, this is in the psychometric tradition.
Okay.
In this tradition, you do have these standardized tests, and the idea is you not only can you do factor analysis to extract this sort of general factor G, common to all tests, explaining the common variance between different tests, but you can also partition out different broad abilities underneath in a hierarchical fashion. There are also latent kind of hidden variables that explain the observed scores between tests. And these tend to kind of divide out into these abilities you're talking about, like sort of crystallized intelligence or verbal comprehension ability.
What is crystallized intelligence?
Well, I mean,
to?
it's because it's a psychometric tradition, it has a kind of inherent limitation in how that is defined. So the idea originally was that fluid and crystallized intelligence were kind of duality of our kind of knowledge bank, our existing skills and knowledge, and our kind of, central processing ability, on the other hand, our ability to reason in novel situations, that's fluid intelligence. But our existing knowledge bank and automated skills, automated knowledge, and our kind of semantic networks that are established in our long-term memory, all of that is kind of crystallized intelligence. But of course, in psychometric traditions, they don't measure a lot of physical skills, for example, but that's supposed to be included.
So is crystallized intelligence referring to, you could say, your conceptual understanding, and fluid intelligence is to step beyond your conceptual understanding to just be open without preconceptions? not necessarily to
Not really.
investigate
So
concepts without bias or agenda?
the best way of thinking of crystallized intelligence is just knowledge.
Okay.
So our knowledge,
So the
semantic
current
networks in the
current
sense of
understanding of
current understanding.
Mhm.
And fluid intelligence is our kind of problem solving, reasoning, conceptual abstraction, all of these kinds of things, where it's a kind of a new situation. We can't rely on our current knowledge to just kind of go through the index file and pull out an
Yeah.
answer.
So
Yeah.
that's what most probably is like some or if not all struggle with. Is that pointing to being identified with your knowledge and not having the capacity to step beyond? And fluid intelligence is, okay, that's what I know, but let me explore this from kind of
Yeah, different angles. Yeah. So
where
um yeah, so I could
you could.
introduce here a kind of a quite a different framework, and it's one that I'm kind of working with
Hmm.
more, that I think is more like getting at where you're coming from, because it really is important to kind of understand with intelligence that there are these different theoretical frameworks in research
Hmm.
tradition, and
Hmm.
we're very, very much used to this idea of an IQ test and this
Mhm.
fixed
Yeah.
attribute and ability and so on.
Yeah.
But it turns out if you look at the research, I mean, you know, college students, they go into college at one end and you take their IQ scores, and then after 4 years in college, you measure them again, and the variance is phenomenal. I mean, you get quite a significant proportion of students who end up with a 20-point IQ difference going into out of college. So
Higher.
it's kind of like, yeah, higher.
Yeah.
I mean, typically, yeah. So
That's-
unless they've gone down some path, but it is possible the other way, by the way, but it's typically not in the college
Yeah.
environment.
Yeah.
And so the Flynn effect that you see over the generations can really be condensed within just a few years, and you
Hmm.
can see this very dramatic variations.
Yeah.
And I think in pretty well, I think about a quarter of retests of IQ tests, there's more than a 10-point difference,
Hmm.
just in general. So there is a kind of what's the word for it? Reifying, kind of making more objective than it is, this idea of an IQ score. I mean, that's one thing. Um, so to get back to your insight, you could say, about the
Hmm.
difference between existing frameworks and ways of looking at things, and how that can sometimes be quite rigid and potentially needing fluid intelligence, for example, to break out of that
Hmm.
and see
Hmm.
different perspectives.
Hmm.
One perspective on that is a very powerful cognitive neuroscience framework that's been developed and really has had a big impact in cognitive neuroscience over the last couple of decades. It's called the Bayesian brain hypothesis, or it's been kind of developed into different frameworks like the free energy principle by Carl Friston.
Hmm.
And the idea is that we have a sort of a whole what's called a generative model. It's like our collection of semantic networks and skills that define a certain kind of way we model the world and generate predictions about the world
Hmm.
based on experience, based on previous use of our intelligence and so on. But we have this sort of standing model of what we expect in the world,
Hmm.
how we interpret the world, how we act on the world, what goals we have, and so on and so forth. And we everything we see is through the lens of this generative model,
Hmm.
and that connects with traditions in psychology related to schemas, and many different theories related to Piaget, for example, and his idea about how infants and children learn new concepts, and they either try and assimilate them into their existing set of schemas and concepts, or they have to kind of somehow shake the system up and break into a new way of looking at things. And so
I mean,
when
that also
our,
would that also include our understanding of who we think we are?
absolutely, we have a
Yeah.
model of ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And so when experience, the kind of data that flows in at our senses, or introceptively through our emotions and through our internal senses, when that doesn't match our expectations, that doesn't match our kind of predictions or expectations, that generates this quantity called free energy. Okay, or it's in other frameworks, it's called prediction error. And in those kind of frameworks, it's that kind of prediction error that drives learning. It drives, it attracts attention. It makes us question why, for example, that didn't match our expectations. And that can then motivate us if it's kind of dramatic enough, to acute enough to start to try and look for other models, look to break our existing mental set and think more laterally and so on. And so there's a way of understanding crystallized intelligence. So crystallized intelligence could be understood as that sort of standing generative model. And then fluid intelligence is the way in which we try and problem solve when we have that prediction error or free energy, where we have a mismatch with our expectation.
But I mean, there's this great quote from Søren Kierkegaard, and he says, "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards." We're like our expectation is always to some degree not matching what is right now, right? Because it's only
that's right
based on what we yet have subjectively experienced and how we define the things we experience unconsciously. What do you think about that?
Well, I think we do actually. My view is that we are these predictive brains. I take this sort of Bayesian brain perspective. I mean, funnily enough, I had a dream last night, or this morning, where it was so vivid. I sort of woke up in the dream, reflecting on the dream itself. And I had the insight that the vividness and the clarity and the detail of that dream was in no way less. In fact, it was superior to my experience here and now, in this interaction, for example, in reality. And so there are researchers, very kind of eminent cognitive neuroscientists, Anil Seth is an example, who has argued, along with Friston and many of these Bayesian brain type researchers and theorists, that really what we're doing is we're constantly generating an hallucination, effectively. We have constraints, we're governed by an external physical reality and external social reality and so on. There are these constraints, but the actual subjective experience we have of reality is our own generation. It's like a hallucination. And it's just a kind of collective agreed upon hallucination constrained by objective reality, you could say, that differentiates, some types of psychosis or psychedelic experiences from everyday reality, And so I think we're very, very good at generating predictions. We're very, very good at modeling the world, and for the most part, isn't that what we all do? And it's almost reinforced more and more now with social media and the way that we've got all these kind of fractionated kind of reality bubbles that are constantly confirming our own point of view, our own models, our own values. And, they're feeding in to these kind of different worlds we're creating, but certainly from a subjective point of view, there's nothing from that point of view other than as sort of some unexperienced constraints that reality itself is kind of giving us on this Bayesian framework. We're the one who's generating this reality subjectively. And so, the extent to which we feel like we've got continuity in space and time, and, things
Hmm.
proceed in an orderly way. And, that's all based on this generative model, and it's all based on our predictions and our expectations on this framework. So I think even though we can retrospectively look back and kind of reevaluate and reflect on
Hmm.
things and kind of adjust some say narratives we create for ourselves and things like that, I still would say, we are amazingly good at
Hmm.
predicting, projecting, this unfolding reality um, we experience.
Hmm.
Um,
That's all absolutely fascinating. And I think that's a quote I found on from you. Intelligence is not merely a function of cognitive capabilities and resilience, but also critically involves the individual's capacity for self-awareness, values alignment, and
yeah,
narrative construction.
yeah. So I'll just briefly describe, this new framework I'm working with. So
Hmm.
on this framework, the idea is that we are um, we're generating expectations. If reality matches those expectations, we're in what can be defined as a critical system point, which is sort of balance between over rigidity and order and kind of over chaos and
Hmm.
complexity. And we tend to kind of try and navigate in a quite self-organized way, if we're functioning well, around this kind of balance point between too much order and too much chaos.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's called the critical point, and it's a
But,
well-known concept in physics.
hmm. And either side is
And
suffering.
yeah, well, I mean, it depends on how you harness these things.
I
Um,
mean, extreme points,
so
being too
yeah,
rigid or
extreme for
too
sure, and
lost in.
psychopathology, yeah,
Hmm.
for sure. And one way you could think about it is again another perspective on intelligence. The psychometric perspective misses completely, which is the way in which we're embedded in intelligent systems around us. And so when you were doing trading, for example, were embedded within a complex system around you where there is information flow, where there may be analysis,
I
or there
think
may be
my
a whole
IQ shrank a
load
little
of
bit over those years. So.
yeah, yeah, but see, when we're in those systems
Yeah.
again, it can those systems can be over controlling and
Hmm.
over regulated.
Hmm.
And when they're over controlling and over regulated, they're moving into what's called a subcritical state. And that's where there's too much order. There are too many sort of central
Hmm.
hubs. And what can happen there? I mean, one theory of why we've got this reverse Flynn effect is because life has become increasingly governed by organizations that are very
Hmm.
managed and controlled.
I mean,
And
tech, you
that's just a
could.
natural evolution of an
Hmm.
organization. And with increasing uh, control in an organization where concepts like scaling, like trust in the process, and all of these ideas, it's kind of giving over a lot of your autonomy, isn't it, to a more situated intelligent system out of your own mind, where it focuses then more on you building crystallized intelligence skills to
Hmm.
be efficient with the given functions that you've been, assigned in your job role. And then that can result in less, a lowering of fluid intelligence
Hmm.
over time. So that might be one explanation, actually,
Hmm. Hmm.
for why there is a gradual drop in intelligence. And so and another flip side of that, I mean, you're interested in creativity, is when you have that more of that kind of top-down control, it tends to be traded off against more spontaneous, creative, bottom-up processing. And so you could that's often sacrificed in the process. And I think you do find in the evolution of organizations, like a business organization, you might have an initial phase where there's more creative insight, there's more lateral thinking, there's more autonomy, individual autonomy. And then over time, if something works and the business starts to grow, then the more top-down automated processes and procedures take over. And then, the idea is to scale it and so on, and then manage a more and more complex scale system. And then, a lot of that initial creativity might be lost in the process. And then what can happen is that unless something is done to offset that increasing kind of top-down rigidity, it could become less adaptive over time, and so there are all these kind of complex processes going on, and in terms of this new Trident system that I'm working on, the idea is that, let's say that you have these expectations and they put you in this critical state. If reality is sort of meeting those expectations generally, what happens if they aren't met and there's this prediction error or free energy? Well, it could either be something that is negative, okay, so it's like an unexpected punishment or a mistake, or something doesn't work out as you expected that's costly, and in which case, in a self kind of regulating or a self-organizing system, what's going to happen is we're going to start using all of this sort of fluid intelligence, executive functioning, to try and reduce that negative free energy and bring it back to that baseline again. So we're going to try and look to minimize uncertainty. We're going to try and reduce risk. We're going to try and problem solve. We're going to try and make effective decisions. And everything is aimed at reducing uncertainty and reducing error. And that's the sort of a basis of executive functioning.
Is that the same as fight, flight, freeze?
Yeah, and it's related to the sympathetic nervous system. It's related, that functioning is more related to the sympathetic stress system and, heightened arousal. And so the idea, that sort of hyper-vigilant, threat-oriented kind of condition that we can be in is when we're primed in that situation where, the kind of the situation that we're confronted with is that our generative model isn't working, that what's actually unfolding before our eyes, or what we expect to unfold, is something, negative, threatening, punishing, failing, or whatever. So we can use one system to kind of try and bring it back down to this baseline of expected free energy. But there's another situation, which is where things are going actually better than we thought. This idea of manifesting, and a lot of these kind of ideas that you find, in alternative, perspectives, where things just seem to be clicking, and it's like you have an expectation and it works much better than you expect. And when things happen, you have an unexpected reward, or something unexpectedly good is beginning to happen. It's like you have this surplus of, positive free energy, and now the system is actually working in reverse. It's deliberately trying to generate more prediction error. It's trying to generate more uncertainty, okay, to bring that back to the baseline again of expected free energy. And so in that situation, that's where I see the origins of creativity and the origins of exploration and adventure and deliberately taking on different perspectives and so on. You're actually trying to generate a lot more free energy, prediction error, uncertainty. That's behind the scenes what's happening to bring your system back to a kind of a baseline of expected free energy. So you can actually measure that in the brain on the theory as net excitation in the global brain's cortical network, or net inhibition. And if you can if there's overall inhibition, we're in that mode where we're trying to reduce bad free energy, you could say, back to baseline. But if there's overall global excitation, we're trying to increase free energy and uncertainty through creativity back to baseline.
Are you fed up of being paralyzed in a corset of rules and dependencies, seeing no way out because of doubts or senselessness, bumbling along numbly in your job, or just toiling away, believing that something is wrong with you, or simply swimming in the conformity soup? In other words, wasting your life waiting around? If that's the case, you came to the right place. The Art of Creating workshop is all about waking up from your trance and revealing without doubt the incredibly creative spirit lying within you, reconnecting with your unique intuition and giving you powerful creative tools that empower you to create your life regardless of the circumstances, the way
amount of free energy there is to process, which kind of relates to how excited we are or energized, how stressed we are. But that could be either good or bad stress. But it's kind of like how energized our system is. And then we can either be energized in one of two different ways. It could either be we're kind of in threat mode and you know, we're trying to kind of reduce the problem, or in kind of positive addiction mode or something, where we're trying to kind of in fact generate more free energy.
But
you know, prediction error.
As I understand, it's not a factor of what objectively is happening, but what is our subjective perspective on what is happening? What the meaning
Absolutely.
we give it in that sense.
Absolutely. So going back to your idea of the meaning, so you've got this going on in terms of it's very contingent on this interaction between your pre-existing kind of mental models and the reality you experience. Okay. But and on this trident system, and we can kind of do brain training to either strengthen the executive functioning to kind of reduce errors and uncertainty and solve problems and make decisions and so on. Or we can do brain training to increase divergent thinking, creative insights, exploration, risk taking, to try and increase potential prediction errors and, you know, the kind of entropy in the system and so on. And in both cases, what we're aiming at is to kind of keep a steady balance going of a certain amount of free energy. It's not completely like everything is certain and everything is predictable. You know, there's a slack there. So we have a certain level of creative, uncertainty that's kind of healthy. You know, we want a certain level of uncertainty. We want a certain level of things don't work out as we expected. You know, we want a certain level of surprise. So that's the kind of baseline expected free energy that we're striving for in this homeostatic system, right? So you can train either of those two modes, like a more creative insight mode or executive mode. But you can also train the way in which we reflect on our life in a kind of meaningful way to kind of build a life narrative that is rewarding and meaningful, that's based on our values. Okay. And that's a more kind of transcendent function beyond that kind of fork that we've just been looking at in my understanding. And to kind of illustrate that fork, that process there, which I'm calling a trident actually, because fluid intelligence on this theory is the ability to kind of switch between these two modes and integrate them very fluidly together, right, for creative insight as well as executive functioning. And that's fluid intelligence. But in addition, okay, so that's something that all organisms have, right? You're going to find that in the guinea pigs over there. You're gonna find that in lots of others, but we don't have this higher reflective, values-based ability to harness those kinds of criticality dynamics in intelligence to kind of navigate our own life story that is meaningful to us and is guided by our values. And that's something quite uniquely human.
And often one hears the left brain being labeled or connected to rational thinking or intellect, and the right brain to intuition, creative insights. What do you make up of that? Is that what you're referring to?
So it's these two. Yeah, that's right. So it's like these two forks. So you imagine a trident. Yeah. You've got the staff. You've then got the kind of hub point where you've got the two forks, top and bottom, and then you've got the central fork. The top fork is going to be executive top-down processing, which is more in kind of threat mode, where you're trying to reduce uncertainty. And I would say a lot of corporations are in that mode, mostly.
Many governments.
It's all about, it's all about, true, and governments. So it's all about bigger organizations where there is more kind of control. And it could be either a corporation or it could be a government. And it's where it's more to do with trying to reduce uncertainty, reduce risk, make everything predictable. And that's, that mode. The bottom fork in the triad, the triad is going to be that kind of creative right brain mode, which is more to do with breaking through entrenched, regular kind of ways in which we will approach a problem. It's like thinking out of the box, lateral thinking, creative insights, but it takes energy, to do all of this. And then the middle fork is what you could call fluid intelligence.
And is that just a question? Is that physically or physiologically related to the corpus callosum?
Not so much. That the corpus callosum is just the bundle of fibers connecting the left and the right hemispheres. It allows for the fluid integration between them. So to the extent that, sure, you have an intact corpus callosum, that's a necessary structural anatomical feature there for fluid intelligence to integrate these kind of two modes. But those two modes aren't kind of exclusively in left and right hemispheres, but there may be biases. But yeah, that's an interesting point, So you need to then integrate across these two forks for fluid intelligence. And that's something called metastability in the criticality kind of framework. And metastability means that you can very fluidly, over a large dynamic range, kind of move between stable points, stable states, across both of those forks, so that you're not just working through a step-by-step rule or an algorithm. You're also able to have a creative insight or make a connection into a new knowledge domain that you hadn't really made that connection before. So you can kind of integrate both of those forks together in this dynamic range, and you can kind of measure the dynamic range as a measure of intelligence, right? And then going back to that fork, the central point is the criticality region, and that's where you have expected free energy. That's where reality matches what you expect from your generative model. And then the staff of the trident is subcritical, which is more relaxed, more introspective, but it could also be very automated, like going for a walk, or it may be some very well learned kind of automated activity that you do, like playing the drums or something like that, where you just don't have to. It's not challenging, it's not stressful, it's a very well learned, well automated behavior. And similarly, kind of that's kind of related to daydreaming, just very spontaneous thinking, but it's always down well kind of developed channels, and it's all very established and automated. And that's associated with what's called the default mode network, in terms of cortical brain networks. So that's like the subcortical, and you need that for rest and recovery. So that's more to do with the parasympathetic nervous system, whereas the actual fork part is more to do with the sympathetic nervous system and energy. So there are all these kind of balances. You've got the balance on energetics, where if you spend a lot of time in, problem solving mode, fluid intelligence, high energy mode, you need time to recover, from that and consolidate in your memory what you've learned. And similarly, if you spend a lot of time in executive mode, you're going to want also to be sure that you can access the more creative mode as well. And there's a kind of a balancing system there. If you spend too much time in a negative inhibitory mode, there are kind of built-in mechanisms to bring you back down to zero again. And similarly, if you spend a lot of time in excitation, there are built-in mechanisms to bring you back up to zero. So I think, the whole thing is kind of in good functioning. This is all balanced out, and we've got this sort of homeostatic processes going on. But what happens is modern society can kind of pull us into systematic biases in that kind of trident. So we're pulled into the high energy stress kind of fork end much more than we're allowed to relax and recover. Or we're in a big organization and we're pulled up into the the top fork of executive control, and we're not really given that kind of time for autonomous creativity, and I think that's, I think, a really useful framework for understanding more adaptive intelligence. And then the way we kind of wield that trident in our lives, you could think of as that, what you're interested in, that kind of higher level transcendent values-based reflective ability to kind of use that trident to create a meaningful life for yourself, that's values-based.
So in a way it's interesting to look at, you could say, from a spiritual or a different perspective on it. We tend to be identified with who we think we are, and we to some degree take things personal, give them meaning in relation to who we think we are. But then are you referring to this capacity to change the context and see things from a more transpersonal, transcendental perspective, and
I would say,
neither
because
dissociating from this experience, but being in the experience itself?
Just if you go back to the kind of fork there, just like you've got the top fork, the executive functioning for dealing with the external world, in terms of making it more predictable, more controllable, automating skills to process it, all of this. The same goes for our self models, so the way we understand ourselves. So you'll often find that someone who is a high level manager, let's say, may self-identify with a very well-defined role for their self-concept. And again, it's within that framework of being more on the top fork, but we need to increase that dynamic range and be more functional and adaptive. We need to also explore that bottom fork, which enables us not only to explore and adventure the external world around us and discover new perspectives and be creative in that world, breaking new channels, but also when it comes to our own self-model, so we can start to kind of challenge our own self-concepts, be creative with our own self-concepts, in that lower branch there. But the higher kind of meta ability I've been talking about, about your sort of life story and this kind of thing, I think you need that to really keep perspective on all of this and really try and integrate it all into a meaningful, coherent life. I don't think we can just rely on that kind of biology to do all of that. I think we need to be human and reflective, to kind of coordinate it.
Yeah. So without a meaningful identity would drawn, and there's this saying, the mystic is swimming in the same sea where the psychotic is drowning. Like, it just comes to mind in the sense of, if we hadn't a self-concept, we would be
you need a balance.
But
that's it.
But then also not too rigid about it in that sense.
No, not too rigid. And actually you can kind of you've got the 3/4 and you've got that middle fourth that sort of enables you to bridge the other two, but you can actually just kind of get caught up in one of those top or the bottom four and push it and push it and push it, so that you lose that ability to integrate across. So, for example, like psychedelic trips or very extreme psychosis in psychopathology, where you lose that integrative ability and you spin off down that bottom fork, you extend it, but you're no longer able to integrate it, through that middle fork. And similarly at the top, you can kind of get profound anxiety disorders or obsessive compulsive disorders, or you could get, a goal obsession, and everything else around you just like dissolves away, and you're just like rigidly pursuing certain frameworks and goals, and you're just pushing that prong, but you're losing the integrative ability.
So life becomes a process then from this perspective, and not a life anymore. Mechanical.
That's right. I would say that's when you're too much caught up on that top prong. I do think there is an issue with too much of that going on, right? In a lot of organizations. I think that's a potential issue. And I think it's maybe, related to the dynamics of growing organizations. I don't know what the explanation is, but it does tend to result in that, where it becomes more process-based and more mechanical, unless you reflect on it and you counteract it.
But the main point also, what I'm hearing from you is, it's a function of ourselves, how we see or experience what is happening. So that's most probably also something which you support people in regaining some kind of degree of autonomy, or in that sense about this.
And that's one of the
automatic functioning in one's brain.
That's it. Because, we're going back to the motives. You were asking about why I'm interested in all of this. One of the interests I've got is, it's kind of like, if we are, as a society, more getting pulled into the idea of control processes and the idea of our role within that kind of control process organization, to essentially automate certain skills very, very efficiently. And so we become extremely efficient with a repertoire of skills. And that's all part of that same branch, the same fork. The automatization of those crystallized intelligence skills is part of that same process as executive control, where you follow a role, you practice a role, you inhibit distractions, and so on. So you're basically forming these well-learned routines and procedures and developing all of those. You probably will have experienced that, as a trader who's really doing
Mm,
well in that job. And so, yeah, as a counter to that, part of the kind of the brain training that's needed, you could say, is to it's great to be able to, automate skills, but it's also ensuring that you're balancing that with this ability to think in a more divergent way, to
mm,
explore, to sacrifice efficiency sometimes,
mm,
generate more uncertainty in the process of this sort of creativity and exploration, and a lot of that requires more autonomy, because
mm,
you can't do that if you're just completely caught up in a role, in a
mm,
job role. So yeah, it's almost like it seems like what I'm benefiting from right now is actually having a job role it's actually a corporation. Um, but at the same time, having my own autonomy
mm.
through my brain training business. And, that it's just that balance which is important, I think. Yeah.
Hmm. It's yeah, absolutely fascinating. Mark, maybe I still have plenty of questions. Maybe we could come back for a second conversation. What do you think about that?
Maybe,
Possibly,
yeah.
yeah,
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah,
It's
let's do
absolutely
that. Let's wrap it up
fascinating.
and do it another time. Yeah.
Yeah, um,
And
yeah.
okay, sure.
First
Yeah,
of all,
let's do that.
yeah,
I agree. Yeah.
thank you so much for your time. Is there something you feel is missing to complete our conversation? A last thought or share?
Well, I feel what's missing right now is me asking you questions about your situation, which maybe the next time round, we'll have more of a chance for. Yeah.
Ah, yeah, yeah, I love to, of course, yeah. Well, this is so fascinating, and it makes so much sense on my own experiences from a different frame of reference. Yeah, so
Yeah. It's just
that's really
another theory,
interesting.
but it
Yeah.
could be useful. Yeah.
No, thank you so much, Mark. Yeah,
Right. It's my
maybe a
pleasure.
last thing before we close. Do you want to share what you do
Yeah.
and how you support people? Like when someone who's listening to this is interested to work with you, what are you doing exactly?
Well, I have a website, IQMindware.com,
Yeah.
and this new sort of system is emerging rapidly in this environment, on this website. And there's an associated lab, Mindware Lab, where anyone interested can participate in some of the studies we're doing to, try and confirm some of these ideas. Um, so I suppose the entry point, if you're interested in this kind of framework, is really just signing up on a mailing list and being in touch, just by signing up through the website. And then you may be interested in participating in some research, or you may be interested in these new programs we're developing. But yeah, so it'd be kind of signing up, I think, would be a good starting point.
Okay, amazing. So we will link it in the description
Okay, great.
so
Yeah,
that
brilliant.
everybody can
Yeah,
go directly to your
yeah,
website and sign up. Thank you,
yeah,
Mark. This was so
yeah.
insightful. I
Okay.
wish you all the best. Speak soon. And also to our dear
So,
listeners. Pardon.
okay, it was a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks, Simon. Yeah.
My dear
Okay.
listeners, all the best. Stay true to yourself and see you soon. Thank you.